To something completely different now, though, ISIL and its annual budget, would you believe? Because remember, ISIL does want to promote itself as an Islamic quote-unquote state, and a state needs to finance itself. As ever, there is a caveat. An ISIL budget, like an ISIL video or an ISIL statement, is hard to verify. Although we do know ISIL is making money from oil sales, taxes, abductions and extortion. Now, according to Al Arabi Al Jadid, that ISIL budget stands at $2 billion, with a surplus of $250 million. Imagine what so many actual states would get for that sort of money. And on top of that, ISIL's been demanding around $200 million for the release of a Japanese hostage. Which all raises the interesting question of how a disparate and, let's not forget, hunted organisation like ISIL is able to handle such large amounts of money. Let's ask Shwan Zulal in London. He's an oil expert with the Kadushi Consulting Company. I'm quite fascinated by the fact that ISIL has a budget, Shwan. A group which is known as a terrorist organisation, some would say, a fighting organisation at the least, and we hear about its budget and its surplus like it's a company or a state. And on top of that, very large amount of money.
It is, definitely. I think the figures has been bounded about at around $2 billion for the coming year. But the people I spoke to and people on the ground and people who are very familiar with the operations of Islamic State, everyone, I think, is in agreement that this figure is really exaggerated. From my point of view, if you look at the recent events with the Japanese hostage taking, this is one of the first time they demanded so much money, because obviously, I mean, one, it can interpret it that the Islamic States are getting tight on cash because their fighters need payment, there's logistics to be supported. And if we go into budget detail, obviously it's very obscure. I can't really, I don't have any figures. But one of the mainstream of income for ISIS at the moment is extortion and local taxes and so on. But because of, they control a large swathe of land, and there's pretty much isolated from all around them. The land they control, there's not much producing, so there's bound to be an end to it, because local population are not very well, the economy is collapsing, so there's not much money to be extorted from people, because all the businesses, all the banks have been raided, and all the resources have been depleted. So eventually, I think they'll run out of money. Unless there's other streams of income, which mentioned many times, where rich donors from, for example, the Gulf countries, from Pakistan, from elsewhere, there's that money. But again, you can't expect billions of dollars coming through, because there's so much restriction now, and obviously there's everyone who's been doing it in the past has been restricted by their own governments.
Even so, even if it hasn't got that much money, it still has plenty, or at least enough to function as the group that it is. How do you think ISIL actually handles that sort of money? They're asking for $1 million ransoms, and I'm pretty sure they don't have a bank account like you or I would. So, how would all this go down?
I mean, the economy is completely in cash. It's all stored in basements or places. As I say, this is just pure speculation. Or from, I know Iraq very well. Even Iraq, which has a quite robust, it's a state and so on, is still very much cash economy. Yes, there are a few banks. And I'm sure the Islamic State have so-called banks. They're not really banks as we know it, but they are vaults. They keep their money, and they're very centralized, because if you look at the structure of the Islamic State, they actually have very good, like a state-like structure, where they have all these councils who deals with the finances, people who, they have committees who oversee the spending and allocation of funds and so on. So they're quite well organized in that sense. So yes, I would say, again, there was an announcement that they're creating the Islamic Bank for Islamic State and so on. I doubt anyone will, in their right mind, will deposit any cash in such bank, especially in Mosul or any other areas, unless you're a high member of the Islamic State, or you have a stake in the bank and so on. Because everyone knows that yes, the Islamic State are here to stay for some time, but eventually they will they will go and their cash will disappear. So it is purely a cash economy.
So the ISIL fighters will go eventually, you think, but they are setting a sort of precedent here. It feels like ISIL is a different sort of group. It's more organised, it's more sophisticated, if you want to use that word, certainly than other so-called terrorist groups.
I mean, they are very well organised. They are well financed in some sense. They control an area the size of Britain, well, England in particular. They have nearly 7 million residents living under their rule. So it is almost, I mean, it has all the sort of trappings of a state, but obviously the rogue ideology and the way they conduct their business, especially in the front, where they, all the beheadings and all the, I mean, I don't need to go into the details, everyone knows how they, nobody can see this can be sustainable. The finances are strained, where people are not happy with the way the whole thing is managed. Businesses are going bankrupt, there's no food, no fuel in the winter and so on. So eventually that will have to give, but because there's such a brutal regime, I mean, we've seen regimes similar, well, not quite on the same path, but Saddam used to rule Iraq with this sort of brutality. People are really scared. Nobody dares to cross or question what Islamic State is doing under their control. But eventually, when people have nothing to lose, they've lost all their livelihood, they lost their property, their businesses, and there's no food on the table. Eventually, that moment will come, and the Sunni communities within, whether it's Iraq and Syria, they have to take that responsibility, because from what I've seen and what is being talked about, the international community is not willing to fight that battle, neither the Shia Iraq or the Kurds.
Shwal Zulal, it's nice to talk to you again on Counting the Cost. Thank you very much for joining us.